Man in the Dark from 1953 in 3D. The first major studio 3D movie. Now, this is a movie that introduces some interesting questions about what it is to be human. Do you see yourself as a custodian of a thing? That body, that flesh and blood machine that you call you? As perhaps a sacred duty that you've been called to shepherd through this thing called life? Or do you live in the moment, here to explore and see what experiences this machine can bring to you? For example, imagine that you knew for certain that on a date in the future, you will lose all memory and perhaps even need to be taken care of. Would that cause you to perhaps scrimp and save, spend as little money as possible to ensure the security and well-being of this future self? Or would you just enjoy the time you have as much as you can and let the future you fend for himself? Let it perhaps end up warehoused in whatever government facility is available. You won't be there to care. Now, that isn't exactly the premise of this movie, but it's a thought game along the same lines. This is a drama about memory and identity with shades of Clockwork Orange. It feels like an episode of The Twilight Zone, perhaps Outer Limits. Unfortunately, the execution is a bit clumsy, and the 3D ham often disrupts the mood. For example, one dream sequence was intriguing so long as it felt like unraveling memories, but when it led to a shootout on a fair ride, it became so comically dumb that I stopped believing it had anything to say. So the drama was promising in its inception, but ended up taking a back seat to the 3D presentation, which is what I came here for, I suppose. Oh no, he's got pot. Pot is so dangerous. 3D movies have been around for as long as there have been cameras, but they were sideshow novelties, using either anaglyph or personalized viewers to watch. Not very suitable for mass consumption. In 1952, Buona Devil was the first to demonstrate to the public at large the use of Polaroid filters to separate the left and right eyes. This is what is known today as passive 3D, and the modern variety isn't terribly different than what they used back then. That experimental release led to the major studios deciding to push it as a way to compete with the then new home TVs. And eager to milk the hype of this new wave of technology, the studio rushed the production of Man in the Dark to be the first on this emerging 3D scene, beating out House of Wax by a mere 48 hours. Some places say one day, I don't know. When it came to 3D history, I had imagined that there existed something of an evolutionary period where 3D tropes were introduced little by little over a variety of pictures until they became what we know today as parody. Man in the Dark dispels my theory entirely. It throws out just about every 3D stereo gimmick there is. This isn't a gentle dipping of the toe in new waters, but an opening of the floodgates. Now, to be fair, I guess it's not really a trope if you're the first one who does it. Ah, it's a spider! The 3D moments are great fun, but largely disconnected from the mood, and I found myself growing disinvested from the drama and just sort of waiting for the next thing. And as such, it ended up feeling a bit long, despite running over 70 minutes. This is a Twilight Time limited edition Blu-ray. Some resellers claim it was limited to 300 copies. This is not true. Like all Twilight releases, they did a run of 3,000, and it has a pleasant little booklet providing an overview of its history. Region A, the sound is fabulous mono, and aside from the trailer, there are no extras on the disc. Although the film seems to be in great condition, and for the most part enjoyable to watch, and on occasion I wondered if a shot could be improved with a little alignment adjustment, but really you have to be pausing the movie and taking a very close look to find anything to complain about. And the flat version is readily available online if you're curious. Now, unlike other 3D movies, they didn't use a specialized system to film this. This was shot using two independent cameras, though I imagine they must have had some method of syncing up the frames, because watching 3D made with an out-of-sync frame might look right, but over time will cause your eyes to strain, and I noticed no ill effects watching this. I did see some mismatched camera glare, which is tough to avoid, and sometimes seen in modern 3D. And I actually wonder if a restorer like the 3D Film Archive would see it as appropriate to digitally remove the glare, or would they consider that the original image and something to be preserved? I'm curious what they would have done with that. I also noticed that occasionally you had one eye bigger than the other, which might be the camera's filming at an angle so that one is physically closer to the other. It still works as 3D, just not something I've seen pop up very often in other 3D movies. Now, black and white works well in 3D. Even when in a dark room, we find here that high contrast makes the 3D so easy to define. And really, a lot of horror movies should do this for 3D versions, and just sort of reduce the colors to a black and white, I think would help in that regard. Now, this is a remake of an earlier movie from 1937 called originally The Man Who Lived Twice. And I decided to seek out and watch it because I wasn't entirely satisfied with how this movie explored its subject. It seemed to skip over the questions that most interested me. Again, as I touched on earlier, did this character see himself as a custodian or as a product of himself? It reminded me actually of something of a Bible story. You see, there's a prophet that tells the king that although he will live out his life without consequence, his nonsense will lead to his sons being castrated and his daughters becoming prostitutes. And the king was happy to hear this because his life would be just fine. So I was curious if this surgery was our main character's decision. And was that decision from the perspective of a custodian? Or a person who only agreed to the matter because it made life a little easier for the time being and passed the costs off to someone that he just doesn't consider to be him. And my presumption was to the latter. As Man in the Dark, the character did seem a bit grumpy that it was coming and referred to it as a death. But I discovered the earlier version had a bit of a different take. In The Man Who Lived Twice, is actually so different that I really couldn't point to a single shot that it had in common. However, it does provide a more generous backstory. Here, we learn that he is facing a serious murder charge and really has no way out, but it was without a doubt his choice, no doubt at all, suggesting this earlier version of the character might have the custodian mindset. But this earlier version is far more on the nose in its philosophy. The doctor is introduced where he gives a long speech from stating how criminality is going to be solved by his science. And what struck me is this monologue touched on a connection between criminals and leaders, shall we say, the go-getters in society. The reason it stood out to me is there are modern ideas proposing a connection between a drop in crime rates that correspond to the introduction of abortion, suggesting a decrease in people from troubled backgrounds might be healthy. However, similar studies and connections can be made between that and economic decline. The punchline being that what we call criminal is just a flavor of entrepreneurship. Did I say that right? I don't know. And to eliminate one will eliminate the other. Much like when China accidentally created a devastating famine by trying to eliminate a nuisance bird that turned out to be vital to the ecosystem. Dogs were not traditionally eaten in China. It began with that famine. That's what it did to the country. So, too, trying to eliminate a certain type of person might lead to similar devastating results in a nation. Although I guess if socialism is your goal, then destroying people is always the means. It's interesting to me how modern ideas usually turn out to be very, very old ones. Now, neither version directly questions the morality of the procedure of cutting out a person's mind. The science is treated as infallible, but Man in the Dark at least ventures out into something comparable to what was depicted in 2004's Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. There's also moments where he's being tortured for reasons he can't comprehend, which is both terrifying and sad. I don't know whether I'm disappointed or amused by this movie. It had so much potential for deep questions about social engineering, but it is closer in execution to a Three Stooges reel, and more concerned with hijinks than consequence. But then that kind of speaks to the very nature of movies and media itself. The fluff floats on top and the heavy stuff sinks to the bottom and ends up in the dark.